Everybody, and welcome also to our online audience. My name's Melissa Leach, I think as most of you know, and I'm the director here at CCI. And it gives me enormous pleasure to be hosting this CCI seminar this afternoon. It's one that, since joining at the beginning of sort of in the summer last year, I was absolutely determined that we should have. And that's to begin to build out from some of the disciplines and perspectives that we're more used to bringing conservation and nature discussions, to engage with some broader ones across the university, and history and historical ecology, and particularly the kind of deep history that one begins to get through people who are working in archaeology, is certainly, in my view, super important. And I can't think of anybody better than to explain why this is actually super important to the way we think about and act in conservation than Professor Paul Lane, who is a professor in archaeology here at the University, but brings an illustrious track record of some of the really pioneering work at the interface of historical ecology and archaeology, particularly in East Africa. And I've had the pleasure of knowing and interacting with Paul on and off over the years, and it's a delight to be able to be in greater contact here. Now we're both in Cambridge. So I hope Paul will convince everybody here that deep history and archaeology are really valuable and indeed necessary to conservation efforts. But that's the debate we shall have. So without any more ado, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. You can tell Melissa's only been here a few months, suggesting that I'm the best person in archaeology to come and talk about this. I have several very distinguished colleagues who are far more eloquent on this topic than me in archaeology. So I hope you will also be hearing from them at some point as well. But it is to make the point, I think, that within archaeology there is a growing interest in our field. In how we integrate our perspectives on shifting human-environment relationships into trying to address contemporary challenges. And I hope to be able to convince you a little bit of that. Melissa asked me just to sort of explain some of these logos as well. I think we know the University of Cambridge one. MIASM is an Arcadia-funded project, one of several cultural mapping projects that Arcadia have been funding, and I know that they fund a lot of conservation work, including through the CCI here, where we're in the process of creating large-scale databases of archaeological sites in various parts of the world, largely as a consequence of the growing number of threats to those sites, but also to create digital databases that can be more rapidly and easily accessed for those who manage the heritage in those countries. And I coordinate a program that's looking at countries in Eastern Africa. We've got several of the teams here, including my project manager, Stefania Merlo, here as well. The ARC logo is one I still retain, although the funding of that project, the formal funding of that project ended in 2020. It was funded whilst I was at Uppsala University, mostly adaptation and resilience to climate change in northeastern Tanzania, and partnering with Rob Marchant, who I'm sure somebody has named. Those of you who work in East Africa certainly will be familiar. And a number of other colleagues, Linus Minishi at Nelson Mandela Science and Technology Institute in Arusha, and others as well. So when Melissa invited me to give this talk, I jumped at the opportunity. But after some sort of reflection, I thought, well, was that really as wise? I jumped at the opportunity because I think it is really important that we archaeologists engage more directly and more routinely with those of you who are on the front line and thinking more cogently than we do as archaeologists about the future and what the possibilities are for conservation particularly biodiversity, other forms of conservation as well. Why I became a little bit trepidatious, if you like, about giving this seminar in front of all of you people is I just worried that you'll probably go away thinking, well, that was just a bit of a sort of a very shallow look at the ecology, and at best he taught us to suck eggs. I hope that's not going to be the case. Do bear with me. For my archaeologist colleagues who have come along, you may have heard of some of this before as well, so I apologize in advance for that. So this is really just the sort of broad overview of what I'm hoping to do, or the argument that I'm hoping to make in this seminar. And I think there are two broad themes two objectives to the seminar. The first is to argue that in many ways we are trying to address the challenges that are facing us now in the future with modes of thinking, of practice, fields of discourse, routine ideas of what one might call, our sort of everyday doxa, if you like, that were developed and emerged in contexts where the type of challenges that they were trying to resolve were very different that we now face. And a key argument, and one I hope that is falling on welcome ears and probably something not especially shocking to any of you, is a need to abandon our very well long established nature culture binaries that tend to separate out nature from human culture. And certainly as an archaeologist, I would argue that there are no so-called pristine landscapes, by which I mean no landscapes that have not been, where humans have not been present and have not been active in the shaping of those landscapes. To think otherwise, I think, has a number of detrimental effects, both on those individuals who perhaps lived in those landscapes and were moved out to create spaces for other species, but without a human presence, but actually never quite without a human presence, because there are always managers and now increasingly tourists in those spaces. But also I think it can create a way of thinking that precludes a recognition of the role that humans have played in shaping the biodiversity that we wish to preserve. So this is really the second element of the presentation. And I'm sorry, some of the text is lost at the bottom of the screen there, which is that understanding how some of our sort of dominant ways of thinking have come about is important, because we need to then rethink those models. You might also be wanting to ask yourself, well, is he going to define deep time? And I think rightly so, partly because I use it in the title of this seminar, but also because I'm fortunate enough to have a chair that is in the deep history and archaeology of Africa. And I, to be quite frank, struggle sometimes in defining what deep time might mean. In terms of my own research trajectory and work, where the kind of archaeology I focus on, I'm concerned really with the archaeology of expansion, the origins and expansion of food-producing societies from the Middle Holocene onwards, and their transformation into other kinds of societies up to and including the early 20th century. So some of the sites I excavate are, in that sense, relatively recent and not especially deep, have deep temporal histories. But this idea of deep time has been circulating in academia for several decades now. And this slide, in a sense, is a sense to reference that other notion of deep time that extends into the Pleistocene. And it's an important place, I think, for us to start, and again, to reconsider this, or to consider my argument that I introduced, was I don't, as an archaeologist, I don't think any landscape we work on can be considered as pristine. Again, apologies for the way things have moved since this is showing on the screen. No landscape can be considered pristine in the sense of having no history of human presence or intervention. And I find this a really important concept when thinking about megafauna on the African continent, in that compared with all other continents, megafauna on the continent, African continent, have survived in to a much greater extent than in other continents, where with the arrival of humans or the introduction of humans into those continents, we see quite rapid extinctions and extirpations of that. And some might argue that this has to do with different population densities, but I don't think this holds up with the archaeological evidence, because we see those extinctions taking place at a point when we're seeing the early human occupation of those continents, whether it is Europe, parts of Asia, or the Americas. So it is not a question solely of, oh, well, Africa just had to catch up in terms of its population density, and then bang, it started killing off all its megafauna. It is the survival of these megafauna, I think, is a really important research question that is still perhaps needs unpicking, if you like, and to understand what it was about the ways humans on the African continent interacted with non-human species that might have been different from the ways in which our early ancestors did as they moved into Europe or into the Americas. With that said, of course, we have been seeing significant and massive reductions in Africa's megafauna, probably from the 1500s onwards, but certainly from the 19th century, the 1800s. And I have I've worked quite a bit on the legacies of the very significant increase in Western desire for and demand for East African elephant ivory from about the 1840s, peaking perhaps in the 1890s, and then once again rising again after the 1970s. But I've not really worked on the archaeology of that later phase of demand and circulation of ivory offered them through illegal networks, certainly today. And the consequences, not just for human societies in what it meant by bringing people in to become specialist elephant hunters, to be specialist porters, moving the elephant down to the coast for export, to be middlemen interacting and facilitating these trade exchanges, what it meant for those communities that were exchanging ivory for imported products, what it meant for those societies that were producing those imported products in Europe and North America that were then used to acquire that ivory. So there are these widespread social and economic changes that we see on the back of the expansion of the ivory trade in the 19th century, but also what it might mean for understanding landscapes and landscape change with, if we even take the most conservative estimates based on trade records of the numbers of tusks being exported on an annual basis from Zanzibar, what it might mean for the landscapes with that constant, a 40 to 50 year period of steady removal of elephants from the landscape and the removal of such a significant ecological architecture on the scale that seems to have happened. I think that also asks us to think about what might have been the world in terms of the sort of diversity of species, the distribution of different habitats, and also the nature of human-animal interactions, and particularly human-elephant interactions in the world prior to this very significant increase in the extraction of ivory. Elephants would have been much, much more numerous within these landscapes, and they would have been perhaps the dominant actor in shaping ecologies in these landscapes, rather than, or perhaps working at the same scale as human actors as well in those landscapes. Of course, as we all know, and I'm sure you're all very aware, as there was growing recognition of the impacts of the 19th century ivory trade on East Africa's elephant populations, this fed into desires and wishes to create spaces for the conservation of elephants and other fauna at the time. And I put this on partly because the ARC project that I mentioned was focusing very much on the Serengeti Basin, to sort of exploring in tandem with the archaeology of that landscape and the paleoecology of that landscape, also exploring some of the conservation interventions and also the narratives about the Serengeti that have been put together with different intent and by different groups. So what this image is trying to convey is that, in all of these contrasting narratives of a particular landscape history, we find a distinct absence of the human presence within these landscapes, a lack of consideration of what humans being present in this landscape might have contributed to that which these bodies now wish to see preserved. So Griesbach famously called for a national park that must remain a primordial wilderness to be effective, and no men sick. I don't know where he thought he'd leave the women behind. I don't know at the time, but yeah, no men, not even native ones, should live inside its borders. So there's again, we're laying the basis of removing these people from the landscape in order to preserve and to conserve the wildlife within there. And this kind of thinking is really very embedded within broader colonial ideas about African farmers and herders in particular. Throughout the colonial period in East Africa and in other parts of the continent as well, there is a dominant narrative trope that farmers and herders are poor stewards of their landscapes. And we get suggestions such as we see in this quote from Phillips Grantham and Vickers Harris on an essay on the causes and drivers of soil erosion in Africa, that these communities tend to overstock, overexploit the landscape, and then when everything goes to rack and ruin, they have to move on and move to another place and set the whole thing in train. And we see it also not just in terms of pastoralists, but also with farming communities as well. And I think it's important to keep in mind that whilst much scientific thinking has changed, fortunately, with regard to the sort of skills of African farmers and herders, and I'll come back to that in a moment, this is still a very strong narrative trope that is active in the modern day and is used by different political and economic interests to once again remove people from landscapes in which they have deep historical, cultural, emotional attachments. And as I hope to argue, in these particular landscapes, their presence has actually been fundamental to creating the context for the kind of biodiversity that we all wish to see preserved. This is a slight side line, but again, just to sort of make the point that, of course, these older colonial narratives have been challenged by a variety of different strands of thought. Environmental and research, environmental historians have illustrated with considerable skill the importance, the sophistication of farming and herding systems that existed prior to colonialism, the whole rise of research on indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge has also led to a greater understanding about how these landscapes were put together and a recognition of the beneficial effects, if you like, when you have the composition of particular species, that leaving possibly certain types of species that might be considered as weeds or as wild or etc., because they actually help enrich the soil biome, making use of and capturing natural processes so that the soil is channeled in the right way to maintain fertility, developing various forms of sophisticated intensive agriculture, again, as ways of trapping soil, moving water across the landscapes for irrigation, retaining nutrients in the land, etc. So I'm not denying that indigenous knowledge, an awareness of the importance of indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, that nobody's aware of it. In fact, we're within the conservation field, this recognition has been there for at least 20, 30 plus years. And UNESCO, IUCN, a whole range of other bodies have done much to promote the importance and the incorporation of an awareness of indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge into conservation interventions and activities. However, I think from time to time, we often get a very ahistorical approach to that knowledge. There is oftentimes a degree of romanticizing about, the pendulum swings the other way, if you like, and there are these sort of romantic models of pastoralists particularly, but sometimes farmers as well, of being primordial conservationists. And such essentialization and ahistorical approaches to traditional ecological knowledge result in a lack of differentiation of how human activities both placed pressure on environments, ecosystems, and biodiversity, and how a human presence has enabled and enhanced biodiversity. Such timeless treatment of indigenous knowledge and societies that produced it also serves to reinforce nature-culture boundaries and situates those idealized as primordial conservationists as part of nature. And I find that extremely problematic, but I'm sure you're very familiar those kinds of arguments in your view. So it's an empirical question that we need to address. To what extent did human interventions within these landscapes enhance or diminish biodiversity? And I think that's really important because we often frame, because of the collective consequences at a global scale of human activity that has presaged what some might refer to as the Anthropocene, tends to frame human activities purely referenced as impact. And that impact, although it's often just left as impact, and impact can be both positive and negative, there is an implication in the use of that word impact, I think, that human activity is always harmful, is always negative. And one of the things I think that an archaeologically informed historical ecology of landscapes can bring is to actually demonstrate those instances where such activity has been beneficial to biodiversity and sustaining biodiversity. And the best case model that the one I'm most familiar with has to do with the ecological dynamics associated with landscape settlement in semi-arid savanna landscapes. Many of those landscapes that are now set aside as natural parks and conservation areas from which humans have been excluded. But there has been a wealth of research by ecologists working in these environments that demonstrate that the presence of humans sets up a whole set of beneficial ecological relationships that over time work through the entire trophic scale and work in such a way as to enhance the general biodiversity of these areas. If I just go back one slide. So the broad argument is that these settlements, sometimes referred to as Burma, but let's call them, use the Maasai term, Ngang. They are seasonally occupied pastoralist settlements, typically with central kraals for livestock that are penned there overnight to protect those animals from predators within the landscape, and also both human and non-human predators, surrounded by individual family houses, typically occupied for one season, then vacated, then reoccupied again, upwards to 20 years, after which these homes become broadly uninhabitable because of the build-up of various kinds of parasites in the accumulated dung in the center from constantly penning night after night over 20 years, or say your wet season or dry season duration that you're residing there. And so that is then relocated to somewhere else within the landscape. And we can see when we look at, this is an aerial photograph from a light aircraft, but we can see them also on satellite images as well. They show up quite distinctly as features within this landscape. So the effect of this is that in these nutrient-poor environments, the presence of pastoralists in these landscapes essentially moves concentrated nutrients, the nutrients build up in these areas of settlement, particularly in the areas where the livestock are kraaled, around the landscape over time, over a number of decades. And by tracking the ways in which and the rates at which different species of plant recolonize these abandoned sites, it's possible to identify a number of really interesting ecological relationships and trends. So as you can imagine, the once immediately abandoned, these engang have a very high phosphate and other manganese concentrations that is only tolerated by particular species of plant. And very interestingly, the first recolonizers are those species of grass that grazers prefer. They're often called, in the sort of vernacular, the sweet grasses. So these are the grasses that both cattle and other grazers actually prefer. So they're the first colonizers. And then gradually over a time, as this work by Maturo, David Weston and colleagues have shown with reference to Ambercelli, but there are a number of other similar studies that you could draw on. There is a steady succession and replacement of different species of grass and trees within these abandoned engangs. So in case you can't read it, this is from 0 to 5 years, and this is over 60 years. So we're looking at the proportions of different species on known abandoned engang. The ones that were abandoned only between 5 and 20 years ago, ones between known to local oral histories known to have been abandoned between 21 and 60 years ago, and those that are said to have been abandoned over 60 years ago. At the same time, we also see some really interesting shifts also in the density of different wildlife that occupy these former abandoned engang or settlements, pastoralist settlements, as measured by the dung concentrations of those species, again, on formerly occupied sites of different ages. So looking at over time, the shift, slight shift in the proportion of Grant's gazelle, a steady increase in wildebeest, variations, a particularly marked increase of elephants after the 21-40 years, etc. And again, this has to do with the changing vegetation of those abandoned pastoralist settlements as we move through time. But it is because they are first colonized by these sweet grasses, they tend to be kept open as grazing lawns, or sometimes they're referred to as glades, within what might otherwise be a mixed acacia shrubland. And other research has highlighted that we find similar beneficial consequences of these abandoned pastoralist settlements at different trophic levels. The study is actually also including, this slide is also making reference to another aspect of pastoralist behavior that has often been decried, and certainly within the colonial literature, this periodic use of fire, burning, selective burning of the savanna to regenerate grasses as well. But just focusing on the abandoned pastoralist settlements, the various studies have shown that they tend to have a much higher invertebrate population, and as a consequence, they tend to have much higher bird populations who are feeding off those invertebrates, compared with areas where there are no traces of those abandoned pastoralist settlements. So this model here, or this cartoon here, if you like, is an attempt to try and show you how this sort of sequence of landscape change takes place. But you can see at the end, even over time, these grassy areas are staying open within these landscapes. And these are the ones that attract the grazers and the browsers, but of course they also attract the carnivores. They become, if you like, biodiversity hotspots within the landscape. And of course, because they're attracting the carnivores and others, the big five, they become tourist hotspots as well. They're what you want to see when you go to the Serengeti or the Masai Mara or wherever it is as a tourist. You want to get your money's value for what you paid for going into a national park. Yet they're created by a long history of human pastoralist activity, within this landscape. But those in the national parks and in the conservatories, those human agents who've been partly responsible through their action, not necessarily as a consequence of a deliberate conservation intervention on their part, but an unintended consequence, let us say, of their presence has been the creation of this biodiversity, but they have disappeared. The human actors have disappeared from these landscapes. So this prompts us a question about how long do these glades stay within the landscape? And we can get some indication by looking at repeat photography. So these are examples of the same view taken in part of Laikipia from the 1925, an area of early colonial settlement set aside. Laikipia was part of the White Highlands and set aside deliberately as part of a soldier settler scheme immediately after the end of the First World War for European settlement. Maasai groups had already been moved from there as part of the 1911 agreement, but other groups were also relocated out of these spaces, and area was allocated as ranches for white settlement. And some of those families still survive within this landscape. And this is a picture taken in 2002 of the same landscape, and we can see, so here's this hill here, we can see these much larger grades. They still survive mostly in these patches, although increased bush encroachment in this landscape. Interestingly, in our archaeological surveys, that were transect surveys through all landscape or vegetation types between the upland areas and even up onto the sides of the upland areas with rangers so that we could walk through different types of bush and open areas in an area that still has a very high wildlife density in this particular ranch. Consistently, or at least the highest concentration of archaeological traces that we located during our surveys were always on the glades. Now, you might say that's a factor of visibility. It's much easier to see something on the ground if it's a grassy area and you're not having to sort of duck and dive between the acacia thorn, wondering what that rustling over there is. That a buffalo or just a Sykes monkey or whatever? And yes, there is some kind of I think bias in terms of visibility, but I'm fairly confident also that many of these glades, and certainly several of the ones that we tested, had been previously settlement sites occupied by pastoralist communities. And one of the sites we investigated, site known as Maili Sita, up on a coal, broad story to take, probably occupied for about 30 years, 1640 to 1670, give or take, given the margins of uncertainty within radiocarbon dating for this time period in particular. But the thing I'd really like to draw your attention to is this very distinct dark line here, dark colored here, that still survives on satellite imagery of the site. There are two things I want to emphasize, or three. This area in the middle is virtually devoid of any archaeological traces of settlement remains like this, with little post holes for the house or a fence line, possibly a hearth down here as well. These are the team sampling across this transect here. These areas instead had much higher artifact densities, middens, ash piles, etc., etc. So we've got a consistent sort of circular, semicircular arrangement of settlement in this area. And it has retained this very distinctive soil mark, if you like, that you can see on satellite imagery. We also map the variations along these transects of the changes in the different nutrients in the soils across those different transects as well. So we have peaks in these areas where those transects cross these areas as well. So that's something that stayed in the landscape for a few hundred years at least. Further to the west, closer to the Rift Valley, just above Lake Baringo, if you know where you are in Kenya, we excavated or worked on another site. Again, you can see it, and this is a 1950s aerial photograph. You can make out these semicircular or these circular concentric rings, dark rings like that. When you get down on the ground and map them, they are a series of very low ash mounds, very clearly marking again these circular arrangements. And this one's perhaps 600 years old, but it remains as it here is in the 1950s. The green is showing the edge of the bush, and this is the open glade here. This is where we mapped the edge of the glade in 2005, I think. But there have been other studies by archaeologists in other parts of Eastern Africa, including this one that was, again, we're missing the top, and I'm sorry for that. It was published in a letter in Nature in 2018 that argued that some of these glades may have survived within the landscape for several thousand of years. Just making the point, if you like, that a human presence within these landscapes and understanding the human presence in these landscapes is critical for understanding fluctuations in overall biodiversity and species compositions within these spaces. We can draw in also the archaeological information from the faunal remains, other related pollen record as well from nearby to help reconstruct those shifts in overall sort of environmental conditions at a landscape scale. And this is something that I'm currently doing with colleagues in and around Serengeti, particularly a former PhD student of mine, Tom Biganagwa, who's now at the University of Dar es Salaam and who was here last year on some of you may have met him, he was here on a research fellowship. But he's leading now the archaeological work on this, building on this really important study of the oral histories of those communities that were relocated and moved out of the Serengeti when the Serengeti was established by Jan Schertler Bender. In an effort, I think, what we're doing, I guess, Schertler in particular was trying to re-situate that the history of the land before it became a national park and relate it back to contemporary populations. And in our archaeological work, we're trying to extend this history a little bit further in time. I'm close to finishing up. So one of the shifts, certainly within archaeological thinking, and I know it's a concept that is also circulating in IUCN and UNESCO and other conservation bodies as well, is this idea of trying to get beyond a simple nature or culture binary and talk about landscapes in terms of their biocultural heritage. And this requires, as this slide tries to suggest, a much more integrated approach and cross-disciplinary approach that aims to reconstruct the ecosystem memories, if you like, of these systems, these landscapes. The landscape memories, in other words, the memories of the peoples who lived within these areas, the place-based memories that are associated with particular locations within your landscapes, and the history of stewardship and change within them. But we also need to be very alive to the real realities of today. There's no denying that the situation in the Serengeti is facing, the Serengeti and adjacent areas are facing severe challenges, partly as a consequence of population expansion, partly as a consequence of the number and density of various kinds of boundaries that interrupt animal mobility on these landscapes. And I think it's also critical to recognize that we can't really set the clock back. We shouldn't be trying to recreate a pre-colonial landscape, not least because what baseline do you work for? Do you go to 1500, 1000 years ago? Which time point do you choose for your recreation of these landscapes? Instead, we need to work with understanding these processes in identifying what one might say are sort of new safe operating spaces for the landscapes, recognizing that in many cases the Anthropocene has pushed us such that most planetary boundaries have been crossed, and we're unlikely to get back within those planetary boundaries. So what can we learn at operating at different local, regional, and continental scales in terms of how can we integrate, if you like, this understanding of the deeper history of these landscapes to develop interventions that are suitable at these multiple temporal and spatial scales. So just very broadly, you may or may not have been convinced by what I had to say. I would like to just end by hoping that we can have dialogue. And just to warn you about archaeologists, we are disciplinary magpies. We see lots of glittery things in other disciplines and think, oh, that would be really wonderful. But like magpies, we probably don't know exactly what the significance of that glittery thing is. But we do reassemble into create other, what I hope might be other glittery things that we can talk about. Thank you very much. Thank
you so much. That was totally fascinating, and I think really did convey to us what you've been achieving over the years, obviously with a fantastic set of research groups, both here in Cambridge and very much with your colleagues in Finland. Great to hear. And I think very relevant for us at CCI, not just because we work in sort of radically interdisciplinary ways and getting those conversations across disciplines going, but also with respect to some of the really big themes I think we're trying to think about collectively. The CCI is taking on a big focus on restoration and transformative restoration might be, and that's very different from the kind of imaginaries of protecting a past wilderness, and is much more about seeing in the absence of baselines how dynamic, viable ecological processes might be sustained into the future. Ecosystem processes that absolutely have people at their heart and always have done. And secondly, I think a lot of what you're saying plays to the debates we're having about what it means to decolonize conservation or restoration, which clearly means, I think, going back to and interrogating some of these narratives, and maybe also alerts one to looking at how some of those contemporary memories that you came to at the end are in fact memories of deeply destructive processes in the colonial era and before, and drawing our attention to bringing those two into our analysis. Anyway, I knew I'd be interested in this and it was wonderful.